Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the fifth Sunday of Easter, which this year falls on May 2nd. A couple content notifications for this episode. In our deep dive, we talk about transphobic policies and violence. And when talking about our second reading, our 1 John reading, we talk briefly about violence against Black people and against trans people.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Our deep dive for this episode is a deep dive into gender and eunuchs. Our Acts reading is about an Ethiopian eunuch who, prompted by the Spirit, encounters Philip and is baptized. And so we wanted to dive deep a bit into who and what eunuchs are and what they have to do with gender and the world today. For those of you who listened last week and heard me say that this week we were talking about love and relationship anarchy, I was off by a week. That's actually next week's episode. But I think you will get a lot out of this deep dive as well in this episode, and then join us again next week where it actually will be love and relationship anarchy for you.
Yay! I mean, to be fair, feel free to love people and have relationships and have relationship anarchy in between now and then. We're not going to object.
That's true, and we will also still be talking about love some in our readings.
Yes. So if any of you find it necessary to explain to, say, a small child what the word eunuch means, also especially if you are doing this explanation in front of their fairly conservative parents, which is a situation that I have been thrown into more often than I really expected going into this job, to be entirely honest with you. I find that the easiest explanation that small children understand is that a eunuch is a person who has had the choice of whether or not to have children taken away from them. Usually, this is not something that that person chooses, but it is done to them instead. And I've never had any trouble having that conversation with children. They get that. They don't usually ask awkward questions when you're in the middle of the worship service and up front, in my experience. And you can talk about the differences that would make in a person's life and get to the actual, useful stuff instead of getting stuck on questions that, frankly, delve far too much into someone's personal private life than you would want to go. So.
Mm-hmm. The one downside to that explanation is that there are aspects to gender that are impacted by someone becoming a eunuch because of the hormones that are or are not present and the possibilities for them in their life. And so that it's a little tricky, and there's definitely space for folks who are old enough to understand to talk more deeply, but like Kay said, probably not the children's sermon time in worship. But there are lots of things that I love about the Ethiopian eunuch, and Kay and I were talking about this, and there are a lot of unnamed characters in the Bible, and we talk about this a fair amount on this podcast, but this is one of those unnamed characters, and so there are lots of things that we could think about, and there frequently are names that are attributed to unnamed characters. The problem in this case of going along with what tradition has said is the name of this Ethiopian, is that they were given a name by men, assuming that this person is still identifies as a man and always has and always will. And because of the ways that being a eunuch impacts what your testosterone levels are and other aspects of gender, we don't know. We know that the Bible was written by men for men, so we don't expect them to really get any sense of the more diverse gender. So instead of using the historically traditional one, when I talk about this character, I will be calling the character Kia, which is an Ethiopian name that means seasonal beginnings. This is from a sermon that my pastor, Pastor Debbie Griffin at Downtown Disciples, preached, and we'll link to her sermon about this, but she preached it a couple years ago in the tradition of Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney. of giving names when we don't know them, so that the people have names. So it's a long explanation for why we're calling the person Kia, or why I am calling the person Kia, at least.
I think Kia is a lovely name. I have generally used male pronouns for the Ethiopian in this story because that's what you find in the text, and I usually take the position of if you're going to do something that's not in the text, you need some proof from outside of the text about where that comes from, and also, to be entirely honest, just habit. But I very much appreciate the idea of giving this person a name that doesn't assume gender. And also, when I talk about the Ethiopian, I try to make a point of, if I'm not going to use a name like Kia, I try to make a point of either calling him a Ethiopian, or I call him a treasurer, or I call him the person that Philip is speaking to. I try not to use the word eunuch as the shorthand referral for this person, because we don't know how much of a choice he had in that. We don't know if that would be referring to something traumatic for him or not.
Yeah. And also, I think about it as, particularly as a trans and non-binary person, if people just said, like, the trans person, the non-binary person, like, that is an important part of my identity. And for me, it is not a coercive part of my identity.
Exactly.
But it's also not the entirety of my identity.
And you can be referred to in different ways, such as the Coloradan.
Yes. I would much rather be the Coloradan. Actually, I don't know what I would most rather be, but I love being the Coloradan. I still tell people I'm originally from Colorado, but right now I live in
I have seen you do that in many, many conversations. Yes.
Yeah.
And to be entirely fair, I now live in Minnesota, but I am almost constantly telling people I'm originally from Illinois because it explains so much. So that's
exactly
fair.
Exactly. So, and my approach to people, biblical or otherwise, when I don't know the gender for sure, and especially in a case like this where there's a good chance that the way, I mean, it's guaranteed that the way this person, Kia, experiences gender and the world from a gendered perspective is not normative.
Right.
And so for me, I tend to use they, them pronouns when I don't know for sure the gender, or when I suspect that the male authors writing for a male audience were not in tune with the concept of gender, and that this person might experience a different gender. So I'll use they, them pronouns for Kia, and Kay will use.
And to be entirely fair, like, it's not like we don't know that the Ethiopian tried to have this conversation with Philip. It's entirely possible that conversation happened, and then Philip just didn't tell the people writing the story down about it because he didn't get it.
Yeah. Or
there are some things we will never know about the Bible.
Yeah. Or there are plenty of times where I don't correct people on my pronouns because it's not safe, because it doesn't feel worth it, because I don't trust them.
Yeah.
And as we'll get to later in the passage, Kia is the one who prompts baptism, not Philip.
Yes.
And so there is this like tension and struggle between, is Philip actually trustworthy? And if so, what does that look like, and how trustworthy within the context of someone whose gender identity is not normative and not dominant?
Yeah.
So, more broadly speaking, this is a passage that I love. I love when eunuchs show up in the Bible, because frequently that is the space that is most explicitly given to trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming people. Peterson Toscano does a lot of great work with this, and so we'll link to his page. But the Bible is actually pretty diverse, and biblical traditions are pretty diverse, actually, in how they understand gender. Peterson Toscano specifically goes with different characters and kind of expands on those characters. A lot of the times it's eunuchs, because they are the easiest and the clearest. But we'll also link to a Twitter thread by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who is amazing.
Yay.
And if you don't follow her, you should. But
unless you just don't have a Twitter account, in which case we are not encouraging you to join Twitter.
I mean, yeah, unless you want, like...
It might be fun, but, make your own decisions.
Yeah, make your own decisions. Also, I have a particular way that I use Twitter that works really well for me, I think. So, But she has a great Twitter thread that you can access even if you don't have Twitter that we'll link to
Yes.
that has some explanation of it. It starts with like why and how gender works, that like angels are non-binary, and then into a like this is how like this understanding became more codified in Jewish tradition of when someone is trans, what does that mean for like for how they're, and recognition and acknowledgement of the someone who is particularly binary trans.
Yes.
They identify as. But then it goes into the many genders that exist in the Bible. So not even just 2 or 3, but I think it's like 6 or 7 different genders exist in the Bible. And so it's just this beautiful like expanding of gender. So you should definitely check those out as resources and people who are doing a lot of good work on gender in the Bible, as well as Austin Hartke wrote a great book called Transforming, which connects the lives of trans people to biblical stories and biblical stories to the lives of trans people, which is really great. So we'll link to that as well. Those are all the things like, as we talk about this, go check those out because those are really great resources.
Yeah.
And this is really important. It's important to me to lift up this passage that Kia is encountering Philip. It's a passage where Kia is reading from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, and it's part of this one of the suffering servant passages in Isaiah. And the connection piece that they're working on, and that comes up most of the time when people are preaching on this, is the connection of this suffering servant being not only suffering, but also being excluded, being pushed out, pushed away, and the ways that that might resonate with Kia, who probably wasn't able to worship in the temple because of both the idea of like who is allowed and the closer in you get, which is part of the tradition around protecting the holiness and the sacredness and being extra cautious with God, extra cautious with who is allowed into these places. To the extent that, right, when we hear about the high priest going in on the highest of holy days, there's like a rope tied around their waist in case for some reason they fall down dead, they can drag them out without anybody else going in. So the Ethiopian eunuch is part of this, both in an Ethiopian sense, that Kia is a foreigner, and in a eunuch sense, that Kia doesn't fit with the ways that they have divided their culture and their community and who's allowed in different places.
And language, for that matter. Yeah.
And language. Yep. And what's beautiful about this, though, is that, so that's in Isaiah 53. 3 chapters later in Isaiah, we get Isaiah 56, which is actually part of the Revised Common Lectionary. I don't remember exactly where it comes up in the church year, but when it does come up, the part that is missing most of the time is the part about the eunuchs, which is really frustrating.
Yes. And yet completely on brand.
Yeah, completely on brand, completely frustrating. But if you go to Isaiah 56, especially verses 3 through 5, I'll just read it for you, but it says, God says, "Do not let the foreigner joined to God say, God will surely separate me from their people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the becoming one, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give, in my house and within my walls, a monument and a name better than sons or daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." I love this, right? This is a blessing for eunuchs. And it happens 3 chapters later, and I wish and I hope and I pray that Philip continued Isaiah with Kia. I kind of doubt it because I don't have trust in people.
Well, to be fair, it's not like Philip stole the scroll of Isaiah from Kia when he left. Like,
it's true.
He still had it.
Yeah. Kia
if
could have
I were reading. Kia, I would have probably kept reading. So, yeah.
Right. And hopefully Kia did, because I think that would be a beautiful affirmation of self and identity.
Also, Isaiah is awesome. So
Isaiah is awesome. This has been particularly on my heart and in my mind lately for a couple of reasons. One, I will also say that I didn't say at the top and should have, is it's not just trans people who connect with eunuchs in the Bible, but there's
Yeah.
also a lot of people who are intersex who have experienced surgeries without their consent, particularly when they were
Yeah.
born. Sometimes with their parents' consent, sometimes without their parents' consent, a lot of the time without full knowledge and informed consent.
Because the history of medical practice is horrifying. Yeah.
Yes. So there is a space of, there are people who were made eunuchs. There are people who are intersex who don't find out until much later in life that they're intersex.
Yeah.
They were born and the doctor said, that doesn't look like I think it should look, so we're going to change that.
And imagine if the doctor could do that about anything, like any part of your baby, right?
Right. Yeah. There is a particularly really gross and problematic way that medicine functions still today, and especially
Yes.
historically, to enforce a false binary of male and female. That's not how humans are. That's not how animals are. That's not how anybody is. That's how a cis heteropatriarchy is. So, not all intersex people identify as trans. Not all trans people identify as intersex. There are two groups that have some overlap, but not automatic overlap. And so that's just an important distinguishing thing. But both groups, I think, have particular ways to relate to Kia in this room. So lifting all of those things up. But this year in particular, in our country that Kay and I live in, the United States, there have been record numbers of horrible bills going through state legislatures against trans people. There continue to be, year after year, killings of trans people, particularly Black trans women and trans women of color globally. I frequently, when I'm on Twitter or Facebook, and all of a sudden all of my cisgender pastor friends are like posting about how awesome trans people are, my heart drops, because I've gotten to the point where I know that somebody said something terrible about us. Somebody did something terrible to us, and everybody's responding to that. In early April, I posted, after another one of these things happened, I tweeted and I posted on Facebook, and I said, as a queer, trans, non-binary, called and ordained pastor, for the literal love of God, a reminder, trans people are divine. Trans kids deserve medical care. I'd like just 1 month without worrying about what awful thing happened when I see people posting support for trans people.
Yeah.
It is really hard to be trans in the world. Not because being trans isn't beautiful and wonderful, but because the world makes it hard.
Yeah.
And trans people are not the only ones to experience this by any stretch of the imagination. We're recording while awaiting the verdict for Derek Chauvin's trial.
Yeah.
It is hard. And anybody that says that everything is fine now because there are Democrats in charge is not paying attention. But this space with Kia and Philip, this space in Isaiah 56, is the space that we also need, that we need to lift up, not because everybody else is trying to make medical care for trans people illegal, but because we just need those reminders. We deserve those reminders because the world doesn't give them to us, because the world doesn't automatically affirm that. Because even in K's in my denomination, the ELCA, you're not guaranteed that.
Yeah.
So.
And yet we have proof in the Bible that trans people have always existed.
Yep. So I love Kia, and I will always love Kia. They will have a particular place in my heart. And they have a particular way in Acts that they open up Scripture. They open up the ideas that the early church had of who counted and how. Right? They open up baptism and membership beyond this gender binary that the church was dealing with.
Yeah.
And I love that. So we'll also link to the thread that I tweeted that was in response to a Breitbart journalist who wanted to quote tweet me and about my new religion of trans people being divine. Just in case you need a little bit more fun and delights of the gift of being trans in the Bible and in faith.
Our first reading today is from Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. The Apostle Philip meets an Ethiopian eunuch, a high-ranking servant of the queen, who is reading Isaiah. Philip shares the gospel of Jesus, and the Ethiopian expands the early church's understanding of who is able to participate in baptism.
Here in this country, we talk about the queen and we mean in Great
Elizabeth.
Britain. But there are other queens in the world.
There are plenty, yes. And many of them are and have been awesome.
Mm-hmm. And many of them are Ethiopian, historically.
True, yeah.
Ethiopia has a long history of queens.
Yeah.
So one of the themes in this passage, which we kind of talked about a little bit in the deep dive, is the expansiveness of the passage. The way that Kia, the Ethiopian eunuch, expands who counts according to the early church. And I was thinking about this and recalling the ways that this has been happening a lot lately with comics and superheroes, that we're getting more expansive understandings of different superheroes. So One of the comic books that I really like is Ms. Marvel.
Yay!
And I only know the new Ms. Marvel. I don't know the older Ms. Marvel. The older Ms. Marvel is like white and blonde, and the new Ms. Marvel is a Muslim girl from New Jersey. Yes. And it's just so fun to think about who counts and who gets to be the heroes, and that because more people are telling stories and because we're being more vocal about who counts in the world, we're getting more than just like the cishet white boys as heroes, which I love.
And it turns out that representation matters not only to the people who look like those new, more expansive heroes, but also to the cishet white boys who might be well served by being reminded that they are not always heroes themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's part of... They've done studies actually on empathy, and part of how people develop empathy is not only from knowing people who are different from themselves, but reading. That when the protagonist is not like you, you develop empathy because you are reading from someone else's perspective. And so part of why girls develop more empathy than boys is because boys are more frequently the main characters in stories. Yeah. Right? And so when we flip
And boys are also more frequently expected to not want to read stories about girls, whereas girls are not really given that option to not read stories about boys.
Yep. And so when we flip that and say, no, read these stories, then it helps develop empathy in boys as well.
Yeah.
Yay, expansiveness.
Indeed. In verse 26, we read, Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, Get up and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So it sounds like at this point God is sending out angels to be biblical GPS, which I'm not going to lie, sounds pretty awesome, and if I were in biblical times, I would have found very useful myself. I grew up in the era before GPS, and I definitely was an adult in the era of unreliable GPS. I have many memories of getting stuck in Iowa cornfields and not being able to get out because my GPS decided it didn't connect to the satellite anymore.
I remember my first GPS, which I actually only lost because it was stolen last year during the pandemic when my car died.
So I like to look at a map for stuff like this, although to be entirely fair, this time I looked at Google Maps because, it's there. So we read earlier in chapter 8, before this reading started, that Philip started out up north in Samaria, where he had preached the gospel and baptized many people and basically started the church in Samaria. And then the angel tells him to go down south past Jerusalem on the road to Gaza in this passage, which is where he meets up with the Ethiopian treasurer Kia. And then, partway through the passage, he is snatched away by the spirit to Azotus. I guess he didn't need GPS this time. Just, automatic teleportation. Okay, that works too. Might have been slightly disturbing, I guess.
Apparition, maybe?
Maybe, yes.
I gotta learn that.
Or was it like a Star Trek transporter and made that beep beep noise? I don't know. And that would have been straight west to the coast of the Red Sea, but not a terribly far.
Straight?
Well, you really hate it when I use that word for anything. It would have been almost directly west, probably. We don't actually know how far down the road to Gaza they were, but generally speaking, westish. Although not actually nearly as far of transport as it was from, say, Samaria to the road south of Jerusalem. And the town there is now called Ashdod, which I learned by Googling the name Azotus, which is the kind of thing that anyone can do. It's amazing what you can find out when you Google things from the Bible.
It is. And scary, because not everything you Google is accurate, but
oh, absolutely.
Names of places is a pretty safe
yeah.
Google.
Yeah, and to be fair, like, sometimes you Google things from the Bible and things that have nothing to do with the Bible show up, and that is a whole separate universe of stuff, yeah. And so then Philip walked back up north to Caesarea, which is in Samaria, which would have been probably around where he was at the start of this whole thing, which would have been also quite the walk. That's actually a fair distance. So I am choosing to go with, it's not that the Spirit didn't want to offer Philip a ride home, but that the people on the road between Azotus and Caesarea needed to hear the gospel, for the reason why Philip didn't get just, swept off back home again, too.
Yeah. I'm not an auditory person. It's ironic because I have a podcast. But that whole trip, seems like it would be a really fun Google Maps. This is how long. Did you do a Google Maps of it?
Not quite. I didn't actually start looking up, this is how far it is from here to here, this is how far it is from there to there, this is how long it would take to walk that kind of thing. I've done that kind of work before. It can be really interesting. But it just seems like Philip is getting thrown around like a rag doll in this story. There's a lot of movement going on.
That is true. I'm going to try and make a Google Maps of it and link to it in the episode description, because I'm just fascinated to see the loop.
Because nerding out about Google Maps still counts as being nerdy. Yes. Which also, to be honest, makes me wonder, why did Philip get swept off to Ashdod instantly like that? Did the people between that spot on the road between Jerusalem and Gaza and over to the west towards Azotus, did all of those people, they had already heard the gospel? Was that, just a Christians-only area by that point? Or, anyway.
Those are good ponderings. I was thinking about this journey and was more focused on the modes of transportation than the places of transportation, minus the angels. I actually wasn't paying attention to the angels snatching people up. But I was thinking about it when, in verse 28, the eunuch is returning home and is seated in their chariot, and they were reading the prophet Isaiah, and it reminded me of, so it'd be really interesting to see, exactly how Philip managed to, get on the chariot and do, some riding along on the chariot with Kia, the Ethiopian eunuch.
Is this a chariot that's designed for multiple people, or is it only designed for one person, and Philip is just kind of hanging off the side like a really unbalanced motorcycle without a sidecar?
How easy is it to hop on and off? Are they stopping for you? Are they not? And I, during this pandemic, have been playing a lot more online games of board games that I have in person, and it started with Catan and has morphed into Ticket to Ride, because Catan keeps making things harder to access if you don't pay for them. So I have fewer and fewer friends who I can play stuff with and chat with. But one of my friends and I have been playing, not every week, but close to once a week, we've been playing Ticket to Ride. And frequently they have a video of a train ride in Norway or something going on in their own background. And they've talked to me about imagining as we're creating our train journeys, imagining what those would look like and what those scenes would be. So now I'm imagining this journey that Kia is taking, that Philip hops on with, as a train journey, and it'd be a lot harder to get on and off, right? But you can go train hopping. Yeah. But then the scenes that would be streaming past their windows, and it's probably a good thing that in fact they are not that this took place, in ancient Palestine and not in the industrialized times, because then they can stop the chariot versus stopping a train for
takes a little more work.
Yeah, but it just got me thinking about what if this were a train and we made a Ticket to Ride trip, and you could do it with your Google Maps of if they had a Ticket to Ride of the Middle East, and you're just the train must stop at all of these places. That would be fun.
Yeah. Well, and actually, come to think of it, when I think of trains, I think about the number of people I know who are slightly obsessed with trains. They are a common interest that people have. Some of those people that I'm thinking of are autistic, some are not. Or, well, in a few cases, some of those people are not diagnosed, in any case. But I'm now wondering, in biblical times, what was the thing that a lot of people were fascinated by? That because trains didn't exist yet. Was it chariots? We don't know.
Maybe. They have horses. I love horses.
Yes, true. Horses are wonderful. And people have been very interested in horses for a very long time. But not everyone is into living animals, and like some people just don't like having pets. And while I find those people weird, that's still okay.
I would rather be weird than normal.
In verse 36, we read, "As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, 'Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?'" So, joining the Christian faith is not quite like a vampire entering your home, in that technically you do not have to be invited in to the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. However, it certainly helps. And, as the verse before this one points out, Philip issued this successful invitation by sharing the good news. The good news. I mentally underline the word good, please, is what I'm trying to say. Threatening or shaming people while inviting them usually doesn't result in a successful invitation, oddly enough. Weird. And for that matter, if they don't show up as often as you would like, once they have been invited, threatening or shaming them into showing up more or complaining when they do show up also doesn't help. So let's keep that in mind when it comes to inviting people to the faith or inviting people to church. I would especially commend to you a post from Tumblr that points out that you don't punish the behavior you want to see in some detail, because it turns out that if your response to someone finally doing something you had been hoping they would do for a very long time is to be negative about it, they're never going to do that again. And I don't blame them.
Yeah, it sounds like you have some real thoughts and feelings about this, Kay.
I have several friends who are actually currently dealing with this in their real lives, and I have previously dealt with it in my own. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I feel like you're subtweeting not every congregation, but like many congregations in this country.
Oh, well, congregations too, yes. I was totally not only thinking about certain family members.
I definitely went the congregational route, but okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Glad it's more expansive than that.
It turns out that if you, try to shame someone for being an introvert for long enough, and then they finally decide to come and be social, and your first reaction is, "Oh, you've decided to join us." I mean, I didn't actually slap them in the face, but the mental image is what got me through the rest of that day, so.
Fair enough. Also, I would just like to clarify a little bit that Philip, in some ways, issues an invitation to the Ethiopian eunuch. But in many ways, Kia is the one who is taking action. So when I read this verse, what I love about it is that it is in fact Kia who says, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" And Kia is the one who's saying, "I want baptism." So yes, Philip sets the stage for it, but Kia is the one who takes action, and I love that because Kia is awesome. And it reminded me of the line in Love Actually when they're at the wedding reception, and the best man is filming the wedding couple, and then I don't know anybody's name in Love Actually.
Okay, so Andrew Lincoln plays the best man. Laura Linney plays the woman who talks to him in the scene.
Yes, and Laura Linney's character is "Are you in love with him?" Andrew Lincoln. And Andrew Lincoln is "What? No." Well, we don't find out till later that he's actually, thinks he's in love with her, not him. But it's this idea of, and she says it, she's I just thought I'd ask the blunt question in case it's never been asked, and it's a question that you need to be asked, because, clearly something's going on. He's not just, enjoying himself.
This is actually one of the reasons why Laura Linney's character is one of my favorites in that movie.
That's awesome. But I love this in this context of this passage where it's the obvious question. And it takes two different routes, right? For Love Actually, he's no. But for Kia and Philip, Kia asks the blunt question, "What is to prevent me from being baptized?" And the answer is nothing. And so they do. And it's beautiful.
Right.
And I love it.
Absolutely. Also, I did not actually see this photo, but I saw someone referencing it on Twitter a couple of days ago. I think the actor Andrew Lincoln has recently had a picture of and by recently I mean like since the movie Love Actually was made, had a picture of himself taken holding a cue card, much like the cue cards he uses in the movie, saying something about, I've grown up since then.
I hope so, because Love Actually really is like a terrible movie.
His character was not,
I mean, unless
was not the most mature of all of them.
Unless it's the like scenes that were cut and the relationships that got cut. Every relationship in Love Actually is like, I find you visually attractive. That must mean I'm in love with you. Does that?
My favorite ending, actually, in the movie is, again, Laura Linney's, because she's the one who ends up with the person she loves, even though it costs her.
Yes.
And that, I thought, was lovely.
That one, that is the one, like, exception to that rule, but even that is, like, a complicated... They don't make it quite as explicit. It's like, you can see that as love, or you can see that as lost love, and it's not 100% clear. But I like that interpretation of it. It's a very different way of valuing love. But like all of the other relationships are, you're physically attractive, let's be in love, or I love you.
Yeah, even to the point of Liam Neeson's character, who spends the entire movie mourning his now dead wife, and his focus throughout the movie is on his stepson. And they are adorable together. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the movie, he is quote-unquote rewarded by having a model show up and be nice to him. And
So that is why I advocate for Let It Snow being Love Actually, but better.
Cool.
So, just saying.
Congratulations, you got your Christmas movie reference in this time.
Yeah. And 2 of them, too. Look at that.
Excellent.
Look at me go. Our second reading for this episode is 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 21. God's love for us leads us to love others, and is so powerful that we can't truly say we love God if we don't also love those God created. So one of the themes that comes out of like everything in 1 John is love, but particularly this passage is love as a first or a primary motivation. So love as the reason, right? God first loves us, and so we love others.
The reason for the season.
Womp womp. Yes.
The reason for all the seasons, really, because, Christmas and Easter and all the other liturgical seasons wouldn't exist if it weren't for the love of God. Aww.
Truth. That's adorable. I could only think of Harry Potter for like a love motivator, and I don't know why. There's got to be other like fiction out there, but I was thinking of like obviously Lily's actions in saving Harry's life and protecting Harry are motivated by love, and that's what protects Harry. And then Harry extends that to other people, though part of his like love motivation is also like guilt and how many people have died in his life. But then
that's fair.
But Hermione and Ron,
it's related to love. It's just not,
Yeah, a little complicated. But then Hermione and Ron are motivated by love. It's a love for Harry. And then that expands to, as Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. And so it expands to a larger love than that. So yay, love.
Indeed. So it's interesting that you should say that the only thing you could think of was Harry Potter, because my first reference for this reading is actually from Harry Potter as well.
That's weird, because we haven't done that much since we became nerds at church. We occasionally have one, but...
I try to have other options, but I like this one. So, in verse 10, we read, "In this is love, not that we loved God, but that God loved us." To theologically nerd out for a moment, this is one of the many passages in the Bible that backs up the Lutheran concept that God's love and grace for us is not based on what we do, but on what God does. Mm-hmm. God already loves us. God has already forgiven us. It's not about whether we follow certain rules or have prayed a certain prayer or attend church on a certain number of days per year in a particular building. Mm-hmm. And I realize that that's kind of long to put on a bumper sticker, but I still kind of want to, because the number of times I have to have that conversation. Anyway, when we follow God's law, or when we worship God, or when we allow our faith to have an impact on our choices in daily life, it's not out of fear. It is not out of fear. It is out of joy and gratitude.
Did we mention it is not out of fear?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
But just in case you needed it repeated, it's not out of fear. Okay. Again, the number of times we have had to have these conversations.
Yep.
And it reminded me of the families of wizarding children in the Harry Potter universe. They don't send their kids to Hogwarts, as far as we can tell, because they are terrified at the thought of what their kid might do if they don't learn how to control their magic. Like, I suppose theoretically there might be one or two families like that, but we don't see them. That's not the primary motivator. As far as we can tell, they send their kids to learn about magic because magic is useful and awesome, and you can do lots of cool stuff with it. And, oddly enough, we learn about our faith for the exact same reasons.
Huh. Amazing.
Not out of fear.
Yes, that is true. And there are people who send their kids to Hogwarts out of fear. That's in the 7th book when Voldemort has taken over and they're forced to.
Oh, well, yes, actually, that is true. But that's not like the real version of Hogwarts.
Yeah, that's not
what
Kay was talking about.
Right.
That's what Emily's diverting to. Tangents.
Yeah, and I would hope that maybe at least a few of those kids who did get sent there for that reason during the 7th book at least found out some of the cool and awesome stuff that you can do with magic anyway. I mean, also lots of other horrible things, but like maybe they actually learned something cool or awesome in the process. So
here's hoping.
Yeah. In verse 18, we read, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love." And my favorite example of this at the moment is Frozen. So Elsa, toward the end of the movie, is focused on her love for Anna. And in that moment, she cannot also feel fear.
Mm.
And because her fear is gone in that moment, which is what was holding her back from being able to control her power over ice and snow, she has perfect control, and she is able to unfreeze Anna and also, handily enough, the rest of Arendelle.
Actually, she didn't unfreeze Anna. The act of true love unfroze Anna, which is a whole deeper level of it. That because Anna,
yes, her love essentially unfroze
yeah.
Anna.
Anna's love for Elsa and protecting Elsa was what unfroze her.
Okay, this is the part where I admit that it's actually been at least 3 years since I saw this movie. Anna is the one who actually becomes the frozen statue girl, the snow maiden. She's the one who's frozen. She gets frozen.
Yeah. So Anna gets frozen because Elsa's ice thing hits her heart. And it slowly, freezes her. And only an act of true love can thaw her heart. And the act of true love is actually Anna going to protect Elsa from being killed by Hans, the, evil prince dude. And that is...
So Anna unfreezes herself?
Yeah.
I actually don't like that as much.
It's less an unfreezing herself than it is, the act of true love is the thing. And it happens to be that she is the one who does the act of true love, which I kind of like, actually. Because if somebody else always has to be the one to unfreeze you...
Well, yes, okay,
right,
that I like.
There's the, I can... If I'm having trouble loving, if my heart is going cold, I can do something about it. I can unfreeze it by an act of true love. So her act of true love unfreezes Elsa, and then what you're saying is true about all of Arendelle, that it is because of Elsa's love and recognition of the love for Anna and the love for everyone that then all of Arendelle can unfreeze.
And that she doesn't have to be afraid anymore.
Yes. So you are right and wrong and right again.
Which is pretty much normal.
There you go.
Welcome to living in the tension. We're Lutheran. This is how we roll.
Yeah. I also have watched Frozen probably A, more times than you, and B, more recently than you.
Yes, I really do need to spend more time with my access to Disney+.
Mm-hmm.
So
I read this verse of "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." And because I have been listening to the audiobook of Divergent, unsurprising anyone of our listeners, I thought of Triss from the Divergent books. But part of what happens, especially in the first book, is she draws on, knowingly and unknowingly, her abnegation traits and her upbringing in abnegation in order to be more dauntless. So it's when someone else is at risk that she is more likely to be brave and to overcome, to conquer, to cast out her fears. And so I just really liked that there was that. It's why she's divergent, and her divergence actually helps her be better at the faction that she has chosen.
Yeah. Sometimes what makes you different makes you better.
Mm-hmm. Truth. And then as we get to verse 20, we read, "Those who say, 'I love God,' and hate their siblings are liars. For those who do not love a sibling whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." I interpret this not as when my brother and I fight, but more as the neighbor type of sibling. But this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, when there is like recognizing the importance of posting that trans people are divine, posting and stating and showing up to value Black lives, to say Black Lives Matter, and the amount of pushback that people get about that. And it's pushback so frequently from white Christians who, like, this particular verse is like...
It just keeps happening from the same people. Like, if it happened from other people occasionally, at least there'd be some variety and the conversations could change a little bit. But no, it doesn't.
No, the person who cussed us out today at the vigil, it's not classy. Loving. Yeah, but, like, that's a piece of it, right? Like, how do you love Black people when you express such rage and anger about even just the phrase Black Lives Matter, let alone the reality of death that Black people face in this country? How do you claim to love God when you want to restrict trans people's access to health and care and healthcare to the point of causing suicide and harm? Like, not cool, people, not cool.
Also, I would jump back to the comment that you made about how this is not about fighting with your brother, and say that I think that the brother-sibling relationship has something to tell us in this verse, because I personally do not have siblings, and to be entirely honest, I have mostly been okay with that in my life. But the thing about having a sibling, from what I understand, is that generally speaking, that means that you can fight, but you're still siblings. Very often, that is part of the relationship. You might fight sometimes, but that doesn't mean you're not siblings anymore.
That's true. My brother and I still are siblings.
Yes. And and there is a certain, like, level of hope for reconciliation that exists in, or level of willingness to work for reconciliation that exists in some of those relationships. The ideal ones that we hold up as ideal, anyway. And when we have that kind of relationship where even when we disagree, we can hope for reconciliation and we're willing to work for it, that's actually part of what loving your siblings looks like. Loving your siblings in Christ. Mm-hmm. You might disagree with them. That doesn't mean that you're never going to reconcile. And you can continue to hope for that, even when you disagree. But that does not include shouting hateful slurs at them in the street. So
yeah, no, don't do that. Don't cuss them out. Yeah. Shout hateful slurs. Also, there's a difference between, like, punching up and punching down.
Oh, yes.
We're talking about punching down now. Punch up all you want.
I would point out that when we use the phrase punching down and punching up, we're not talking about, like, tall people and short people having a fight.
Yeah, we're talking about power.
Power versus,
analysis.
Yes. I had this hilarious mental image of a very tall person and a very short person saying, "I'm allowed to punch up."
Right, like, I can punch Kay, but Kay can't punch me.
That's not how this works. No. Please don't go around punching each other.
Yeah.
And I'm not just saying that because I'm almost 6 feet tall.
Oh, this is brilliant.
Our final reading for this episode is from John chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. In the final farewell discourse at the Last Supper, Jesus uses a metaphor about vines and branches to teach the disciples about the fruit they would bear by living in his word.
So one of the themes for this is vines and plant growth. You will hear a lot about it from me for, like, the entire everything. But the first thing that came to mind was the reframing of the Batman series, and particularly Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze and their roles as villains. That, like, what if, in fact, Poison Ivy is just trying to regrow plants and tackle the excess of carbon that we have been creating in the world. And Mr. Freeze is trying to challenge global warming.
Yay!
So they're actually, like, fighting for the environment instead of against it, and humans are just getting in the way, and Batman's the really evil one.
Well, Batman doesn't have to be evil. He could just not understand what's going on. He could be clueless.
Yeah, he could be the white moderate.
Yes. Oh no, there's a white billionaire who doesn't understand what's actually going on in the world. How weird. In verse 1, we read, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. So God is a gardener. I am not much of a gardener myself. I tend to kill plants even when I'm not trying to. But a few people who I follow on Twitter are. And Ursula Vernon, the author, is definitely one of them. And from what I understand, gardeners are often in their full glory when they are covered in dirt and surrounded by bugs and mud and growing things. And so for a moment here, reading this verse, my mental image for God shifted to that gif of Marie Kondo saying, I love mess. And I thought that was great. So. But when your life is a mess, think of God as Marie Kondo saying, I love mess, and you'll feel better.
That's fantastic. I love it. I do think that resonates. There are a lot of critiques about The Shack, the book The Shack, but I love some of the characterizations of God, especially Papa, and the actors who played God in the movie. And it is that, it is about gardening. It's about the messiness. It's about being in the midst of it with each other.
Yeah.
I was looking at verse 2 and thinking about every branch that bears fruit, God prunes to make it bear more fruit. And, okay, I am terrible at this. When I was in Minnesota, I had a couple tomato plants, and what you're supposed to do with tomato plants is pinch off the little extra sprouts that start sprouting, because then more energy goes towards the ones that are already there and already have flowers that are going to become tomatoes. And I've just never been good at it, because I'm like, ooh, that's going to be a new tomato, and that's going to be another one. And so then I just let them all grow, and it's not really helpful, but I am just really bad at it because I want them all to grow because yummy tomatoes.
That is maybe the most on-brand thing I've ever heard you say. When we reach verse 4, we read, Abide in me, Jesus, as I abide in you. So abide isn't a word that we use a lot these days. It means to live, to dwell. Not just a hotel room that you might stay in for a night on a road trip, but a place that you know well, a place that you can walk around safely in the dark, a place that you understand. So in the Hunger Games, Katniss visits the capital, but abides in District 12. Mm-hmm. In The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits travel through many different places, but they abide in the Shire. Mm-hmm. And in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker abides in his uncle's home on Tatooine until suddenly he doesn't.
Then where does he abide? There is a correct.
I'm not really sure he abides anywhere for a while there. He does seem to abide with Yoda for a little bit.
Eventually,
but
he abides in the Force, and the Force in him.
Aww. But the Force isn't Jesus.
Details.
If the Force was Jesus, I would be able to move things with my brain, and I am still angry that I can't.
That's if Jesus was the Force. It's like the square rectangle thing. All squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares.
Yes,
we're talking about if the Force is Jesus, not if Jesus is the Force.
Right.
I was looking at this passage, and in verse 6, reading, it says, Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. And, some people are like, ooh, look, hell. Just don't think this is talking about hell. I think, ooh, repurposing. That is a good use of material that's not bearing fruit. Burn it and create warmth. Recycling. Awesome.
Or possibly feed it to bunnies,
Yeah. There is a person who is close to my heart who keeps the, metal parts off of the top of coffee bags. And at one point, I was like, why do you, what do you do with those? And she was like, oh, they come in handy sometimes. You can use them to wrap cords together. And I was like, that is brilliant, because I have all of these cords to all of these devices and charges. And
they're basically giant twist ties.
Yeah. So, this is a life hack. If this isn't working for you this way, here's how you repurpose it. Life hack.
But now I'm also having the I'm now also wondering, like, what if instead of Jesus just constantly using this metaphor of burning things as repurposing, what if instead Jesus had just constantly referenced feeding things to bunnies instead? And how different would the church be?
Then the, like, killer bunny from...
The whole Easter bunny thing would make so much more sense.
Well, and the killer bunny thing from Holy Grail would have a whole different meaning.
Yes, those are actually my bunny slippers. My bunny slippers are the bunny from Holy Grail.
Nice.
You can tell because they have a mouth with teeth.
Well, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 6th Sunday of Easter. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do, or you want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.